I really look forward to our questions conversation together, because really I think this book is a book that lends itself to conversation and deep discussion about our own particular relationship with death, which of course is varied depending on our experience. So I'd like to spend the first 30 minutes of the talk. I'll introduce myself briefly, and then I'd like to go through the 4 sections of the book and do a reading from each section, just a few minutes, probably a 3 or maybe 4 minute reading from each of the 4 sections, because I think these sections, they reveal these key messages, which I think I'll talk about in a minute, about the reason that I wrote this book. But I just want to thank you all for coming tonight, because there's so many ways we can spend time, and there's so many things to listen to, and I just feel very honored that you've chosen to tune in tonight. And many of you in this grid that we are making up together are certainly experts in the field, so I don't count myself in any particular position, other than I've spent my life's work in this field of working with people with cancer at all stages, actually. But this book is about how people face into that time when they've been diagnosed with a cancer diagnosis that will likely take their life. So it's that living under the shadow of death, and how can people do that and really learn how to face into that and live with some kind of purpose and meaning, which to me is essential for us to be able to connect to life in that time. So I'd like to, as I said, spend about 30 minutes and brief introduction, and then we'll move into the time of questions, conversation really. So I'd love to hear from those of you who'd like to turn on your video at that point, and we can have some time together. So just a quick run through my background, not to bore you too much, but I started out in geography, actually. I thought I might be a geologist, and I studied geography, and then I discovered psychology. It was at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and quickly discovered I was very, very interested in psychology and how people work and how people tick, and that's actually led me into studying psychology, and that was my first degree there. And then when I decided I wanted to travel the world, I thought, well, nursing would be a wonderful profession to be able to see the world and travel the world. So I did that in Edinburgh, and ended up moving to Vancouver in 1984, and ran into someone many of you knew, Liz Smith, wonderful, wonderful social worker, hypnotherapist who worked at BC Cancer Agency in those days. And she said, oh, come and work at BC Cancer, which I did for over 10 years, and ended up going back and getting a master's in nursing, and really started to look at, what are families' experiences of cancer. And I became more and more interested in kind of the silent voices, in a way, the parts of people when the disease of cancer, by necessity has to be so central to the care there. But I found there were other voices that perhaps weren't being spoken, the voices of the heart and the spirit. And I discovered Commonweal, which is an amazing center in Bolinas, California, under the leadership of Michael Lerner and Rachel Remen, and went down there and studied with them. And they said, just come back to Vancouver and start your own retreat program, which seemed a bit daunting. But they said, it's one of these things you just have to learn. And I pulled together this incredible team of people, who many of whom are still involved today with Callanish. We called it the Callanish Society, based on the ancient stone circle in the Outer Hebrides on the Isle of Lewis. I love the mystery of those places, those mysterious places that hold a lot of energy and a lot of mystery. And I think when we're looking at illness and healing and dying, there will always be a great deal of mystery to that process. So I love that we called it by a name that wasn't cancer, but obviously had some deep meaning for us. It's actually become quite a pilgrimage site, actually, for people to go to Callanish. And we've got lovely pictures of people standing in the middle of those 56 standing stones. It's the largest standing stone circle actually in Europe. So wonderful to make that connection. And it's been a beautiful name, and I think a lineage that we somehow we belong to. So I'll just say a little bit about myself as a writer, because it's something that I didn't even really consider myself to be. And I still kind of trip over that word a bit, which is interesting, because I I've always written just, stories to myself. I've written diaries, and I actually went back to Scotland recently, where my mum still lives in Glasgow, and I found a 5-year diary, the ones that had the little locks, and you always lost the key and you had to break it open. And usually those diaries would be, you were really keen to do it for about 3 weeks, and then it would just fizzle out. But actually, I found in the 5-year diary, I found I actually had written something every day almost for 5 years. And it was from the age of about 12 to 17. I thought, wow, this is going to be fascinating. I can actually figure out what was going on in my teenage years. Of course, it was the most boring thing you could ever read, and there was no depth to it. It was all about Sunday was hair wash night, and what this teacher was doing and what that teacher was doing. And it was incredibly boring, and I was very disappointed. So I don't think my writing career got off to a big start until I got to Simon Fraser University Writer Studio in 2011. And that's really where I discovered I had never done a writing course in my life. And I joined this amazing community. It's really an amazing community of writers under Betsy Warland's leadership. And I met my non-fictionistas writing group there, and we stayed as a writing group for several years after that writer studio. That's where I started to write stories about the work that I've been doing for 30 years with people with cancer. And I started to enjoy learning about the craft of writing. And I have to say, hats off to my writing group, because I had really no idea what I was doing. And I remember one person said to me, well, you really write in a rather passive voice. And I was embarrassed to say, what does that mean? And now I understand what that means. And but I didn't really know anything. So I learned a lot in that year. And then I went on and had some different writing mentors over the next few years. Humber College, a wonderful mentor, Isabel Huggin, who lived in France. And I used to mail off 10 pages at a time to her because she didn't want to do email, and I'd wait 2 weeks to get it back, scrawled with comments. And she was an amazing, amazingly helpful. She taught creative writing at Humber College in Toronto for years. And she really smartened me up, actually. And she really challenged me on, I'd use the word spirit, or I'd use something that was way too kind of airy-fairy for her to say, think, what are you actually saying? What do you can't just throw away these phrases. And she really helped me kind of smarten up my writing and really think about what I was writing about. And of course, when I'm writing about such matters as death, it's not an easy thing to put into words, that experience of being with people at the end of life. And so, I've had many people help me. So it took me about 8 years, because I was working full time and still am. And then I thought, how am I going to get this book published? And I really had no idea. But because I'm from the UK and I've always loved the connection to the literary world there, I was a big reader, of course, like most of us are, and managed to get myself an agent in London, which was, again, one of these wonderful sort of serendipitous events. And he turns out he knew a lot of people and sent off the manuscript to 19 different publishing houses in the UK. And very quickly, within a week, I had some interest. So it all happened sort of faster than I could imagine, and got probably the publisher I would have chosen if I could have chosen any publisher in the UK, called Canongate, independent publisher, incredibly well respected, and have published some amazing books. So I was very lucky that in just March this year, the book got published there first. And then Doubleday Canada picked it up and published it 2 weeks after that. Of course, I was in the UK, spent a year thinking about these events I'd be doing to publish this book in March. And there were 6 events, and I managed to get to 2. And then the whole thing, of course, the pandemic hit the UK, and I had to get out of there pretty quickly when Justin Trudeau said, come home. So it's all been very interesting, and hence here we are tonight. We were supposed to do a beautiful event with Banyen Books at the Center for Peace. We had about, I think, 250 at least people who had registered for that. But here we are tonight, and of course we all have to be incredibly adaptive in this time, and it is remarkable how adaptive we are as humans in this, very difficult up and down roller coaster that most of us are finding. So here we are tonight, and Just to say a few words about why I wrote the book. I know that I was collecting stories, and my friend Maureen, my Cree friend Maureen Kennedy, said at some point, she said, I think you've got teaching stories, and in our tradition, there's a time where you need to release those stories into the world. And she was very encouraging, and another mentor of mine, really. And she said, you know, just keep writing them, and you'll know which stories to write, because, you know, I was just choosing 20 stories, and I could have, out of hundreds of stories I could have written, but each story to me had a kind of lineage and legacy to it, that it could go into the world and continue to be a teacher. And these are people who I'd met along the way, some of them personal friends and family, but people who I feel were able to lean into that dying process in a way that really illuminated some very important things for me that I learned. And so it was kind of a quest for me to understand how to be with people at that stage of life, that I, you know, selected those 20 stories. And, you know, I've read all the books there are, because I'm interested around death and dying and healing and cancer. And I looked for a book that wasn't prescriptive, and there's a lot of books about the good death and the right way to die. And it always didn't sit right with me, that idea that there is a prescription of how we should do that. And so I wanted to write 20 stories that were different, to show that really there is a wisdom inside each of us, that, you know, if we have the luxury or the privilege of being able to choose how we want our death to be, then you know, that's a wonderful thing. And I don't think we can prescribe for each other what that should look like. So, and that's really the philosophy at Callanish as well. We have a center here in Vancouver. It's, you know, there's so many prescriptions about living with illness, and I feel that, you know, it's really an obstacle to people if we put that prescription on people to say how they should live with cancer. It seems to me very unhelpful. So I wrote the book to tell these stories, for these stories to be a legacy for the people who lived those lives and who died. And the families of those people have been just incredibly moved that their loved one lives on in the written word out into the world, which has been very, very moving to me. And I also wrote it because I feel that still in our culture, we're frightened. And I think right now it's becoming more and more clear, isn't it, that, you know, mortality just walked into everybody's living room, including the well people, not just the people who live with an illness. And I think we still think of death so much in our culture, or at least aspects of our culture, that death is a terrifying ordeal, and people are still, they're very frightened of it. So I wanted this book to be a consolation, to be a reassurance that death is a natural part of life, and that, yes, it can be extremely complex and very difficult, and it's not always an easy path. In fact, it's rarely an easy path, but there is something about it. Just as we come into the world, we leave this world, and I think there's a kind of intelligence in us that knows how to be born. I mean, those of you who've given birth, the baby at some point does birth itself. Excuse me, let's have a sip of water. And so there's actually, I think there's a similar intelligence at the end of life, where the body knows how to die. And I've been at many, many deaths, and I really believe there's this natural intelligence that we do know how to do that, just as we actually know how to grieve, even though we are frightened of grief, and we're frightened to grieve when we think about losing people we love. So I wanted this book to reassure people, and I've had some really beautiful comments from people who are at the bedside of a loved one who's in the process of dying. And it's been really lovely to hear that the book has been helpful, and that's what I really hoped it would be. And I think the other reason that I wrote it is that I really feel like we need to be more empowered in our relationship with death. And I think we need to kind of empower our communities. We've really given a lot over to healthcare. And I mean, I'm a healthcare professional myself. And I think we've deferred a lot of our, this knowing and this knowledge that we have to help the people we love at the end of life in a in a way that, you know, lives on in us after. And those of you who have accompanied, if you've accompanied people at the end of life, you know that journey is with you always, and it's not always easy, and it sometimes leaves regret, and we all know that. But I think that we've lost our knowledge about how to do that. Of course, hospice palliative care movement is doing an amazing job of helping us reconnect to that, and we're on the right path for that. And the death doula movement seems to be taking off too, which is again this idea that people need accompaniment and we need skills. We need to learn how to do it. So I think that's a good sign that we're getting back into that idea that it belongs in our families, it belongs in our homes if it can be. It's not always possible, but it also we can really fully participate. So I wanted to read the first from the first section of the book, because I know I'm going to run out of time, but I'll just carry on till we have time for questions. And the very first story in the book is a story that's very dear to me. It's the death of my friend Karen, who was one of the co-founders of Callanish. Her and her partner, Kathy, lived up in the Caribou for many years. And Karen got a diagnosis of cancer and had basically from the diagnosis to her death 3 weeks. It was a very, very hasty and difficult, very, very, devastating time for all of us at Callanish, but also obviously for her loved ones. So I went up, I kind of packed my bags and I left and went up there for the duration to help them in any way I could. And it was a very pivotal experience for me, even though I'd worked in oncology for so many years. I left that experience feeling changed, and I had this sense of empowerment that I'm talking about, where I thought we can really do this for one another. We can really help each other at the end of life. And I want to read a small passage just to my tribute to Karen, but also to speak to this idea of, you know, being there with people in a particular way. So I'll just jump into the story, and this was up in their home in 108 Mile House. I could hardly believe how small Karen had become. She had always been such a fit, muscular woman, an avid tennis player until her late 50s. She joked about having a left bicep as large as Navratilova's. The weight had fallen off fast since her diagnosis in December, and her arms barely had the strength to lift a glass of water to her mouth. The desire to eat and drink ceases at a certain point when the body no longer wants sustenance, a sign that death is near. But even with such a tiny body, Karen's presence in the room was enormous, mesmerizing, like a harvest moon on a clear night. Karen was asleep, her head lolled to one side and her breath raspy. She slept for a couple of hours after that and then awoke. Her half-opened eyes darted around the room as though she was tracking something compelling. I can only describe the place I go to when I'm half awake with 2 words, she told us. Golden love. Golden love, she repeated. And I felt a rush of reassurance relax my body. Kathy looked at me and smiled. There had been many shared moments of friendship when Karen's wisdom had disarmed us, dissolving any point of view we had thought worth holding on to. For years we've wondered what happens when we die. I have news for you, she murmured. It is like we thought, but more, so much more. The great love that we come from is the same love that catches us at the end. It's so beautiful. Karen's words that were like fragments of truth landing clickety-click into exactly the right place, the only possible configuration. She had always said spirit is the ubiquitous substance out of which each life arises and passes away. She called this substance consciousness, and said it was benevolent and eternal like love. Some people might name this loving substance God. She didn't. She believed that when the body dies, the energy that animated the physical form merges with consciousness. I'm jumping a little bit here. Karen had been unconscious for a couple of hours when I sensed another change. Her breath was shallower and the breaks between breaths lasted several seconds. Her hands and feet were cool and mottled and her lips pale. Death had been lingering in the house for days, but had now moved closer. What's happening? Kathy asked, feeling the shift too. We'll stay right here with her, I replied. Karen's eyelids fluttered as if dreaming. Should we say goodbye? Kathy asked. Do you want some time alone with Karen? No, I just wondered if I should give her permission to go. Tell her I'll be okay. Kathy's face crumpled at the pain of imminent separation. I moved from the foot of the bed to the head where Kathy sat and put my arm around her shoulder. We've been saying goodbye to Karen ever since we knew she was going to die, I said, stroking Kathy's tousled hair. She hadn't slept much, lying on a mattress on the floor by Karen's bed the last 2 nights. There's not one moment to say goodbye, but a series of moments through which the ending slowly unfolds. Kathy leaned her body sideways onto the bed, her head resting on Karen's chest. I don't want to say goodbye. We've had such an amazing life together. Karen's breath was like a whisper, the out-breath slightly more audible than the in-breath. I can't imagine Karen needs permission to go. Do you? I said. She always was the boss. At this, we both laughed, surrendering our attempts to move the situation along. A dog barked a few houses away. The room was quiet, except for every so often when one of us said, I love you. No other words made any sense. Then the screen door banged against the side of the house and a rush of cold air pushed in on us. The wind had prized open the latch. We had opened the glass door earlier that afternoon so that Karen could feel the fresh air on her skin. Tears flooded our eyes as we understood that the end was near. 10 seconds of stillness between breaths felt like forever. Another long exhalation, followed by silence. 20 seconds, 30 seconds. I knew to wait. Even after a minute, there might be a final breath. And there it was. Karen breathed one more breath in and out, and then her life was over. When we go back to these stories, it's like we're there. There's such an imprinting, I think, that happens at these remarkable times in our life, some of them extremely difficult, extremely sad, but they live in us. And I always think about that beautiful phrase that says, death is the end of a life, but not a relationship. And every time I conjure up somebody I've loved here at Callanish who's died, or someone in my own life, I feel I can evoke their presence, and it feels to me like that relationship is ongoing, which I'm so grateful for, which is kind of the opposite of what so many of the grief books tell us to do, which is to recover or get over it or move around it or get through it. And I think it's really not like that. I think we learn to make a place for people inside of us, and we're lucky if we have people who will talk with us about those people and keep those stories alive. So thank you for listening to that story. And I'll read maybe one more reading. So that first section of the book is opening to death. So the 5 stories in there, that book are really about people who've said, I want to open up and face into that is happening. I want to know how to do that. I want to be prepared, and I want to talk about it and have these, what I think of as very courageous conversations with our families. And of course, they don't always happen because it's not everyone's nature to talk openly about difficult things. So it's not that that's the right way to do it, but I think it, excuse me. I think when we're able to open up the conversations, it can really help us come into a way of being together that I think can help so much ease everyone through that process of dying. The second section, of course, is when that doesn't happen. And I've called that section Accepting the Unresolved Heart. So as we know, life can't be tied up in a nice, neat bow at the end of life. And we all know that deaths don't always go as we hope, and best laid plans happen, and they don't always go as we wish. And so there's a lot that we have to live with after someone dies when it hasn't gone the way we expected. So how do we live with those unresolved parts? And I wanted to write a few stories about that, because it seems to me that's so much a part of life after for many people who have to live with this wish that it had been different. And how do we find peace with that? So I think that's an important, and I think given that we're almost at 7:30, I'm just going to go through the 4 sections, and then I'll do one more reading, and then we'll move into questions. Section 3 is probably the most, I would say, complex and difficult section of the book, where the stories that I tell are people who have specific work to do at the end of their lives or before the end of their lives, where they've had a specific situation or a time in their life that was very difficult, very dark. Sometimes these are from early life, and they're things that people often think they have to go to their grave with. And it's one of my beliefs that, you know, we can find help to deal with those things. And at Callanish, we've helped a lot of people with difficult things that they thought that they couldn't deal with before they died. And sometimes that's unresolved grief. We've had a lot of people who have had early loss as children who, when they come to their own death, find they haven't grieved their mother or their father. There's other people who've gone through neglect and abuse. And so these are very difficult stories in the book, but I think they're very important stories. I think they give a lot of hope to people who feel like they really do want to meet that demon or that difficult time and move through in some way. So there's some very, I think, very important stories in that section of the book. And then the last section I've called Surrendering to the Spacious Heart. And I think that's where we put our own lives in a greater context. And sometimes that just happens to us, but what do we lean into? What helps us? And we're not alone in that process mostly, although the people who are alone without family often find other things to lean into. Maybe they're, especially right now, this is happening, where caregivers become extremely important. And you can lean into a stranger even who shows you kindness and respect and can look after you in those last days of life. A lot of people lean into nature. It's something that I've woven through the whole book, actually. I think to me, it's a very important part of seeing the cycles of life and death in nature and how we can relate in our own lives. It's everywhere. I was in the forest today, our beautiful endowment lands. I go there many, as often as I can to really be a part of that larger view of life and death. And it's very, very helpful. So the stories in the last section of the book are really, they're stories of kind of surprising things that can happen that really come to meet us in our life. And I've been hearing a lot of people speak about that right now in this very difficult time, that surprising glimmers of hope through things that happen in interactions with people or in the natural world that really sustain us, and they really hold us up, and they help us to remember that even in difficult times, there is still joy and delight. And maybe I'll just end, so many stories I could read for you, but I think I'm going to read just a couple of sections from a story. It's chapter 18 of 20, and young woman in her early 40s called Jen, who that's actually her name, and she had an incredible interaction with a hummingbird building its nest just after she'd had radiation for brain metastases from breast cancer. So I'd like to read a couple of sections from that story to me, just to end this time. And I feel like I've just got started. So anyway, this is this is Jen, and the story's called Awe. Jen felt anything but robust when she first met the hummingbird she named Wiki on her deck at home. She was recuperating from brain radiation for metastases secondary to breast cancer. I met her first when she attended a Callanish retreat 2 years before the recurrence of cancer, and we had stayed in touch. I learned the story of her connection to this little bird and was so moved by the inspiration that nature offers, often at the times we need it most. Out of the corner of one eye, Jen noticed a flash of iridescent green amidst the new bamboo shoots emerging from shiny black stems. She had planted a pot of black bamboo 2 years before on the small patio adjacent to the sliding glass door of her home office. She loved the way the wind rustled through the tall stems and new leaves in the spring, casting light and shadow across her work surface. She saw the green flash again as a rufous hummingbird flew into the bamboo with strands of dried moss dangling from its tiny beak. The nest was miraculously attached to one of the wider stems of bamboo, just a few inches from the glass door. Jen was mesmerized as the hummingbird returned again and again, bringing pieces of light gray lichen, shavings of wood, and fine silver threads from spider webs. The tiny construction project was well underway by the time Jen succumbed an hour later to her daily afternoon nap. When she had awakened earlier that morning, she'd been overcome by the desire to pull the covers over her head and retreat from the world. She had promised her husband Gerald, as he leaned over to kiss her goodbye, that she would get out of bed, make breakfast, and attempt to get some work done at her desk downstairs. "Don't waste the day," he called to her from the stairs on the way to the garage. "Easy for you to say," she thought to herself. "You try being chipper when you've just had your brain irradiated 5 days in a row." She'd been annoyed with him for days. In fact, she was angry with every healthy person she encountered. Her family and friends had no idea what it was like at 40 to be dealing with a second recurrence of breast cancer in just 6 years. Most of her friends were wrapped up in successful careers and looking after young children, too busy to spend time with her. An occasional text or email was the best they could do. She understood their priorities, but was still hurt by their neglect. "Don't worry, honey, have a good day," she had called back. And then I'll just skip over a few pages and read you the last section. 5 days after the first sighting, Wiki spent more and more time sitting in her nest. She looked comical, squished into the tiny woven cup, with her wing feathers fluffing out over the rim and long tail feathers standing upright. Wiki's eyes flickered from side to side constantly, as though scanning for threats, and occasionally her eyes would close for a few moments. Each morning thereafter, Jen woke earlier than usual. She looked forward to spending the day in her big armchair downstairs and hardly noticed her tiredness or vague, persistent headache. On the morning of day 7, Jen saw that Wiki was gone, so she carefully positioned a footstool against the glass, stepped up, and looked down into the tiny nest. She saw 2 minuscule white eggs, the size of marbles, lying side by side. She felt a surge of love push through the glass from her heart at these miracles of creation, and the thought of the tiny heartbeats already fluttering inside. Jen and Wiki sat nestled in day after day, keeping one another company in the waiting. Jen rarely thought about her illness. Caring about another living being had swept her up, distracted her from her problems. Awe had been the antidote to despair. And then it goes on to say about the babies learning to fly, and she watched the whole process and sent us photographs every day. So we were part of it. So I'm aware it's 7:37. So I hope that didn't feel too rushed. There's so much more I'd like to say, but let's open up. I really would love to hear your questions, and maybe we can talk more through that medium of conversation.
Janie, it's Karen.
Oh, hi, Karen.
Hello.
Hello.
The current situation with the pandemic, how is that impacting the work that you're doing at Callanish and the people that you're working with?
Thanks for the question, Karen. It's been a very difficult time for our community, and probably most of you know that there's a lot of things changed in the cancer world because, of course, making space, and a lot of people have had surgeries canceled, treatments canceled, especially clinical trials that people had hoped to do. So it's been a very difficult time. What it showed, I think, many of us, including many of the people that come here, is how resilient people are who've had a diagnosis of cancer and who've lived through, so I'm seeing the amazing adaptability, but it's very difficult. And I think the other part to me is the most difficult part of our work at this time, is that there's been so many restrictions, as we know, to visitors. And so people have been going for chemotherapy alone. They've been in the dying process with very few family, maybe one person allowed, maybe two, until the very end of life. So I'm hearing from family members how disturbing that is. The VGH palliative care unit, which is the top floor of the tower, and had to move to GF Strong Hospital to make way for the COVID units at VGH. And of course, then they come under the system in a different hospital. So it's been very, very challenging for families. And we've been trying to do creative things, and we've come up with some wonderful ones for that young woman who was who couldn't have any of her friends. So the young adults, their friends are so important to them. We created a beautiful strings of prayer flags with portraits of her friends that I had taken from retreat. And we actually put them onto fabric, and we put words that the person had given us as a word for this young woman who was dying or is still in hospital. And then we strung up 24 prayer flags and actually delivered them to the hospital room. So what I'm seeing is so much creativity. We have to, what can we do when there's so much we can't do? And I think that's really the philosophy that we've had to adapt, because there's so much grief and sorrow about not having the people. I mean, this book is all about that, being there with the people you love, and then it can't happen right now. So we're trying alternate things to, we made a beautiful video for a young man that recently died. And again, we had, I think 25 people because he could hear, did an audio message or a video message for him. So there's things we're trying to do, but it's been difficult. Thanks for the question. Nice to see you.
Janie, can I ask a question?
Yes.
It's my name's Glenn. I'm here with my mom, and it's my sister's birthday. She would have been 47 today.
Ah.
She passed away at 42, 5 years ago, of cancer.
Uh-huh.
My question is, you've been with a lot of people, when they've died. And I was with my sister when she died, and she was breathing really heavily, with a lot of labor. And then there was a moment her face was looking at the window, and there was a moment when her face, which was sort of tortured, just completely relaxed, and I could see her again. My sister, and she was actually looking at my brother-in-law at that moment. And she was filled with such affection for him, is how I saw her face. And it was a moment of complete surrender. And I was so glad to have glimpsed that, because she was struggling for so long. So I was wondering whether you've experienced that, or how often that happens, or what exactly is happening there.
I have experienced that, and actually I experienced that with my own father, who died of a brain tumor when I was in my 30s. And exactly how you described that, there was a lot of labor. It was like, I felt like he was working very hard, and my mother was there, and my 3 siblings and I and our spouses. And it was exactly as you described, in the sense of suddenly there was a change, and there was a change in his nature, you know, his eyes changed, and he looked at my mother, you know, they'd been together for all those years. And I felt, and I've written that story in the book because to me it was a very, very important moment, and a moment we all go back to, like you've described. Thank you for sharing that. They're very sacred moments, in I think they're very personal moments. So I appreciate you sharing that story. It's very difficult, but it's, you know, they're very, and I'd hate to try and put words in a way to that. I do know the experience myself, and I don't want to try and in a way analyze what's happening, but I did feel, how I wrote it in the book was, you know, all those years of love passed between them in those moments of the gaze without words. And I think that's, I don't want to say it's the same but as your situation, but it really touched me deeply, that something was happening and there was communication happening and the suffering was eased. So I think that's a, you know, to me it's very, you know, sometimes we wish for these things to happen and they don't, but when they do happen like that, I think that, well, they do stay with us forever, don't they? So I'm sorry for your loss, both of you.
Thank you.
And, you know, you live on with that. Yeah.
Thank
you so much for sharing that.
You're welcome. I was trying to get a sense of, does that happen in only a very small minority of cases, or does that often happen in your experience?
I would say it's not common, but it happens in different ways. I mean, some people are very conscious right up until a few hours, or even sometimes less than that. And so those are quite amazing things too. Some people go through days of unconsciousness before they die. So it's such a unique process. And, you know, recently someone I know, you know, there was a lot of days of unconscious, and then, you know, people wake up for a few hours. That's quite common too. So again, it's each one is so different. And I think when we get those moments where there's connection, when hasn't been for some time, it's, you know, again, it's a very precious thing. So
Thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate
thank you.
Thanks for sharing about your father as well.
Yeah, nice to meet you both.
Thank you.
Hi, Janie. This is Elizabeth Morwick.
Hi, one of my writing friends. Hi, nice to hear your voice.
Yes, I don't have video on this particular device.
That's okay.
You had mentioned something about death doula, and I had just recently come across that term as well. Can you speak to that? And that I read that there's a program or a certificate, I'm using air quotes, certificate one could get. So I'd like to just know your opinion about that.
I'm not an expert by any means. So there may be other people in this group who are. There are different courses, and people are definitely getting training. I don't know about how long that training is and what their experience needs to be to do that training. So I do have questions about it, and I'm interested to learn more about it. I think that so many hospice and palliative care nurses, I would call death doulas. I would call family members who are there for the duration. So the doula is this idea of, it's like comes from the midwifery world, the doula that assists people during birth. So a doula at death assists people in the dying process. So I think that's where that originated from, kind of taking and that idea of helping people through the process. And I certainly know families who have had death doulas. I think it's becoming more common, and they've been very helpful to people. I personally don't know so much about it, but I'm curious.
I'm curious too. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth.
Hi, Janie, it's Carla.
Oh, hi, Carla.
How are you? Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
I wonder, Janie, if you could talk a little bit about the kind of discipline associated with kind of writing the book, the kind of writing process itself, and the kinds of things that were helpful to you.
Oh, it's a great question. I wish I've got some writing friends who are laughing at your question. Because we talk about this endlessly, you know, how to discipline ourselves, because, you know, like anything creative, it's not, I mean, we all have different ways. So I'll talk about my process, which I'm not a very good writer every day kind of person. So I'm a very immersive, like I like to go on, you know, silent meditation retreats, immerse myself in meditation. So with writing, what I've done over the years, and it's really worked for me, is I've gone away, any place I can grab that someone would be willing to lend me, you know, like a little cottage or a cabin or whatever. I've gone by myself away, you know, with food, with nothing but kind of my computer, my notebooks, my thesaurus, and that's when I've done the most of my initial writing, because it's always those first drafts that take a certain, the editing I feel I could do anywhere. I could do it on the bus, but it's that first draft that's, you know, again, that you really have to be in a creative space. Sometimes you get on a roll, and I've had those times where a whole story will come out. But what surprised me most, I think, about writing a book was how much editing happened. You know, I think, wow, like I can't believe how many times a story, you know, I'd like to pull out the original stories. They wouldn't be recognizable. And I've had a lot of help with that, because people have their own ideas. And one of the challenges with my book was that, should I be in the book more? Should I be in the book less? Should it be more the stories in the third person, or should I be in relation? So there was a lot of discussion. My writing group friends who are on this call, you know this one, where some of them would say, you know, you're in it far too much, or we want to hear more from you. So it's been, that was a very interesting process. So I would say that the discipline itself takes, some people are extremely disciplined about, I'm writing today for 2 hours. And I really envy that. I wish I was someone who could do that, get up at 5 and write till 8. I'm just not that kind of person. And I really would like to be, but I've learned that I'm not that kind of person. So I'm now in the process of figuring out, well, how am I going to create some space? Is it possible to start writing again? You know, 'cause it's been quite a process just getting this to publication. So discipline's a great word, and for the writers in the group, we all know that each of us does that differently, but it is a thread that you can't let go of. That is something I know, like this book has just been, it tugs at your heels. It says, no, come on, you've got to get this done, and nobody's making me or making us do that, except a voice that says keep writing. And I tell you, my group and the ones that are here, the encouragement from my writing friends has really kept, I would say, the discipline of, you know, showing up together. And that's probably been one of the most helpful things. Other people who get that it's a hard thing to do. And it takes time, at least for most of us. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Lovely to see you.
Thanks, Janie.
Rena? Can you unmute yourself? Yeah. Good.
Okay, just a follow-up to that. So do you have another book on the go? Are you making notes? Is it in your mind? What are you working on?
Well, I was kind of ambushed by my editor in the UK when I went the time before last, because she just suddenly said, so second book, what's happening? And I was just like, what? You know, I thought I was maybe I had one book in me, but a second book? So she got me thinking, of course. I thought, oh, they want me to write a second book. So, but I have been thinking about it lately, and I've got some ideas. And actually this week I asked somebody if I could start to do some interviews. And I've probably got about 10 people I want to interview. And it has a bit of a different twist than this book, but I'm very interested in the concept of hope, like truly, like how people define that. And I'm very interested in the people who live longer than they're expected to live. And I'm curious about that, not to create any recipes for, you know, that by any means, or prescriptions, but I'm very interested in people's process through when it doesn't go as people have told them it will go. So what's that all about? So there's lots of, so I don't quite know what that will look like as a book, but we'll see. And
Great.
sometime I'd like to write some fiction. That's always in the back of my mind. But we'll see.
Good
Thanks
luck with that.
Yeah. Thank you. We have about a few minutes left.
Janie?
Can I ask you?
Oh,
Okay.
Catherine.
Go ahead.
Catherine? Yeah, hi, Janie.
Hi.
It's Catherine.
Nice to see
I've
you.
I've known you since we were babies.
I know.
I'm a palliative care nurse now in home care, and I guess mine isn't really a question. I'm just thanking you for writing this book, because it's the families when I'm out working that are almost in a discord. The wife is ever hopeful and her poor husband is passing, or their son is dying and the parents can't understand it. I really think this book is going to be helpful. We had final gifts for years, but this has you've touched every little nuance. And I really thank you for that, because families that I've sent to Callanish have just come back refreshed, restored, and their loss is still anticipated. It's still going to happen, but their coping is so much better because of what you do. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. That really means a lot. Same back to you, all of you working out there and in homes and hospices. I feel the same way. We're sort of all in this together, So,
Could I speak?
please. Yes, Pat. Hi, Pat.
Hi.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah.
Nice seeing you. I just want to mention just a short bit, because someone talked about death doulas, and a friend of mine who Janie knows well, because she was very involved with Callanish and loved it. She did have a death doula with her. I was not part of it, but I was around it a bit, and it was a team of 4 women who were there, but one of them is trained as a death doula, which apparently you can get that training at Langara, maybe other places too, I'm sure. But it was an amazing, beautiful experience. And it seemed like the death doula herself, she was sort of the overall person who administrated everything, the wishes of joy and what she wanted. I mean, others did too, but she was there to make sure that everything happened step by step. And to the moment she died, and then afterwards, and Joy wanted to stay at home, and she was. And anyway, I think it's a wonderful, wonderful role that someone can play. And I also want to say, Janie, I just loved what I've heard you say about your book. I really want to get it. I remember way back when I was used to when someone died in my life, and at that time was Kubler-Ross. And I remember also reading a book. It was called. It was based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but I can't remember. I think it was called Letters to Somebody. I can't remember that, but it sort of guided me through at that time. But what I loved, something I read before about this happening, and you talked about, or someone advised you not using the woo-woo language, and I thought right on, because that really, for me, having had a woo background, it's part of my spirit, and there's a place for it. But I think just really everyday language is so important to be able to speak to people, and for yourself too. So anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Maybe we've got time for one more question. Hi, Veronica.
Hi, Janie.
Hi,
We
Neil.
just wanted to ask a quick question. Neil and I, having benefited from your wisdom in person at Callanish for the past year, I think we both often wonder, because we turn to you and your team for strength. Where do you get the strength and wisdom to help all of us?
Great question. Lots of others could answer this too. Those of you who are out there working in this field. It's been a process, I would say. I think in the early days, I lived and breathed people's stories and their lives, and I couldn't separate. And I just didn't know how to, or what that even meant. And then I thought we were kind of taught that we should separate. So I think I went through a time where I thought that's how you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to, have what they call professional distance, and, and there's compassion fatigue if you don't. So there's a lot of education around this that I actually don't support, in a sense, for me personally. So what I learned is that if I can really fully step in with a full yes to the people that I meet, not knowing how long that relationship will be, and the learning and the gift of that relationship, I trust. And the practice is about grieving. I mean, the grieving has to happen to stay vibrant. And I see in the healthcare world people who seem to have gone missing. And I often think, that they haven't actually found a way to grieve, and I think we do that. I do that with the team. And I know a lot of nurses have their buddies where we just really know how to talk about it, and we can really support each other. And it's like we embrace, at least I can say this for the nurses that I know, embrace such a fullness of life outside of the work. Like, it's like we just like, I'm going to grab hold of this life, and the adventure, the travel, the things that I do, and the walks in the woods and the cycling and all that is really how I balance out. But I want to stay connected and intimate and close to people, because it's like I've said before, that to me, letting the heart break is what keeps the emotion moving. And then there's life, right? When we get stuck and restricted and constricted by not letting the emotion happen. I get angry. I mean, we've talked about this at Callanish. Some days I'm like, I can't bear this, and but we have to learn to feel and express, like, we all do. So I think the heartbreak is the biggest learning for me, is that I'm not afraid of it. I'm not afraid to say, I'm going to really miss you. I'm going to really miss. I think we're good at our language of intimacy, I would say, just like how we talk about these hard things that are happening, but we try to talk about them. And, we cry a lot and we laugh just as much, as from our circles. So thanks for the question, though. It's a really good question. It's something I think we all think a lot about. And I couldn't do it without a team. I know that's really, and especially a team of people with a good sense of humor. As you know, it's essential. It's absolutely essential medicine. So yeah, thanks. Nice to see you both.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, we have 1 minute. Does anyone have a very quick question? Well, I'll just close up with a thank you to Banyen Books, and to Jacob and Colin and the whole team there, and just all of you. I feel like we could just talk into the wee hours of the night, but I'm sure you have other things to do tonight, and just want to really thank you for coming. I've really enjoyed this. I've done these other things where I can't see anybody. I'm talking into a void, and it's like, anybody out there? So I really enjoyed this because I could see you and hear you, and lots of friends, and to meet new people too. So thank you so much for this time together. Bye.
Thank you, Janie.
Bye, Lana.